Fat Karen brought a fake priest to court, and Judge Judy's exposure went viral in minutes. But what Karen didn't know was that this wasn't just any ordinary priest costume. It was stolen from a real church, and the man wearing it had a criminal record that would destroy everything. Karen Middleton, a 52-year-old suburban terror from Connecticut, strutted into Judge Judy's courtroom like she owned the place. Her bleached blonde hair cut in an aggressive bob that screamed entitlement from every angle. Her oversized designer handbag, clearly a knockoff but flaunted like the real thing, swung from her pudgy arm as she adjusted her too-tight leopard print blouse that strained against her considerable bulk. The rhinestone cross pendant hanging around her neck caught the harsh courtroom lights, a mockery of the faith she was about to exploit in the most shameless way possible. Before we dive into this incredible case, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing where my viewers are around the world. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss more unbelievable cases like this one. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the video. The mahogany-paneled courtroom buzzed with its usual pre-trial tension, the American flag standing stoically behind Judge Judy's bench, while court officers shuffled through paperwork with practiced efficiency. Karen's beady eyes, heavily caked with blue eyeshadow that made her look like an aging pageant contestant, scanned the room with predatory satisfaction. She had spent weeks planning this moment, convinced that her brilliant scheme would not only win her the $3,500 she was demanding from her neighbor, but would also humiliate the elderly Mrs. Patterson who had dared to challenge her illegal fence installation. Behind Karen, shuffling nervously in an ill-fitting black suit and crooked white collar, stood the centerpiece of her deception. Father Michael O'Brien clutched a worn Bible with sweaty palms, his receding hairline glistening under the fluorescent lights as he practiced blessing gestures that looked more like he was swatting flies than invoking divine grace. The truth was far more sinister than even Karen realized. This wasn't just her unemployed brother-in-law Gary dressed up for a harmless con. The priest outfit had been stolen from St. Mary's Cathedral 3 weeks ago, along with several valuable religious artifacts, and Gary's desperate need for money had driven him to crimes that Karen knew nothing about. Karen leaned back in her chair, her multiple chins jiggling with self-satisfied laughter, as she whispered to her fake priest, "Just stick to the script, Gary. These court people are idiots. Judge Judy's just some old TV judge who thinks she's tough. Once you start blessing things and talking about moral obligations, she'll eat it up like everyone else." Her voice carried the same condescending tone she used with grocery store clerks and restaurant servers, dripping with the assumption that she was smarter than everyone around her. The diamond-encrusted cross bracelet on her wrist, another cheap imitation, jangled as she gestured dismissively toward the bench where Judge Judy would soon appear. What Karen didn't know was that Judge Judy Scheindlin had built her legendary reputation by destroying exactly this kind of arrogant deception. At 81, the sharp-eyed former family court judge had seen every con, every lie, and every manipulative scheme that desperate people could devise. Her steel-gray hair was pulled back in its signature style, and behind her glasses, those piercing eyes that had intimidated thousands of litigants were already studying the preliminary case notes. Something about Karen's witness list had immediately raised red flags. A priest with no verifiable credentials, character references that seemed too convenient, and a plaintiff whose story had more holes than Swiss cheese. The stolen priest costume hung loosely on Gary's thin frame, the fabric cheap polyester that would never pass close inspection by someone who knew real clerical garments. His hands trembled as he fumbled with the fake rosary beads that Karen had bought from a Halloween store, the plastic crucifix already showing chips in its gold paint. The irony was lost on both conspirators. While they plotted to use faith as a weapon of deception, real consequences were closing in from multiple directions. The church theft was being investigated by both local police and the FBI due to the valuable artifacts involved, and Gary's fingerprints were all over the crime scene. Karen's neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, sat quietly on the opposite side of the courtroom, her genuine distress visible in every line of her weathered face. At 78, the retired teacher had spent 40 years working with difficult children, but nothing had prepared her for Karen's relentless harassment and property destruction. The illegal fence that Karen had installed not only blocked Mrs. Patterson's garden sunlight, but had actually damaged the root system of century-old oak trees that had been in her family for generations. When Mrs. Patterson had politely asked Karen to move the fence back to the property line, Karen had launched a campaign of intimidation that included late-night music, garbage thrown over the fence, and threatening phone calls. Judge Judy's bailiff announced her entrance, and the courtroom rose as the legendary judge strode to her bench with the confidence of someone who had never met a liar she couldn't expose. Her black robe flowed behind her like the wings of an avenging angel, and when she settled into her chair, those famous eyes immediately locked onto Karen and her suspicious priest. In that moment, before a single word was spoken, Judge Judy's instincts told her that this case would be anything but ordinary. The body language, the nervous energy, the too-perfect setup, everything screamed deception. And Judge Judy had built her career on making deceivers pay the ultimate price for their arrogance. If this elaborate web of lies and stolen religious artifacts isn't exposed today, Karen's criminal conspiracy will destroy not just one elderly woman's life, but the entire foundation of truth that Judge Judy's courtroom represents. The stakes couldn't be higher because this isn't just about a property dispute anymore. It's about a pattern of escalating crimes that started with harassment and has now spiraled into federal theft charges that could send both Karen and Gary to prison for years. What Karen doesn't realize is that while she's been plotting her courthouse performance, FBI agents have been building a case against her fake priest that could unravel everything she's ever built in her suburban kingdom of manipulation and intimidation. Detective Sarah Martinez had been tracking the St. Mary's Cathedral theft for 3 weeks, following a trail of pawned religious artifacts and security footage that led directly to Gary Peterson's desperate gambling debts. The stolen priest vestments weren't just costume pieces. They were hand-embroidered silk garments worth over $15,000, blessed by the Archbishop himself, and considered irreplaceable by the Catholic community. When Martinez discovered that Gary was scheduled to appear in Judge Judy's courtroom, wearing what appeared to be clerical clothing, she immediately contacted the court's security team. If Gary wore those stolen vestments on national television, it would be the evidence needed to close the case and expose a network of theft that had been plaguing religious institutions across 3 states. Judge Judy's reputation for sniffing out deception had been built over 25 years of confronting every type of liar imaginable, but she'd never faced someone audacious enough to bring stolen religious artifacts into her courtroom. Her producers had already flagged this case as potentially explosive because Karen's background check revealed a history of insurance fraud, false police reports, and what appeared to be a pattern of targeting elderly neighbors with frivolous lawsuits. The show's legal team knew that if Karen's deception unraveled on camera, it would create one of the most watched courtroom moments in television history, but it would also put Judge Judy's credibility on the line if she failed to expose the truth. Mrs. Patterson's life hung in the balance because Karen's harassment campaign had escalated far beyond property disputes into systematic intimidation designed to force the elderly woman from her home. Medical records showed that Mrs. Patterson's blood pressure had skyrocketed since Karen moved in next door, and her physician had documented stress-related symptoms that directly correlated with Karen's increasingly aggressive behavior. If Karen succeeded in court today, it would validate her tactics and likely inspire her to intensify her campaign until Mrs. Patterson either sold her home at a loss or suffered a stress-induced medical emergency. The $3,500 lawsuit was just the beginning. Karen had already filed complaints with the city about Mrs. Patterson's garden, her mailbox placement, and even her choice of house paint colors. The Catholic community was watching this case because news of the stolen vestments had spread through church networks, and Father Thomas O'Sullivan from St. Mary's Cathedral had personally called Judge Judy's producers to warn them about the theft. The real priest explained that Gary had posed as a seminarian to gain access to the vestment storage room, claiming he needed to borrow items for a religious education class. Security cameras captured Gary not only stealing the priest costume, but also pocketing a valuable silver chalice and hand-carved rosary beads that had been donated by parishioners' families as memorials to deceased loved ones. If these sacred items weren't recovered, it would devastate a community that had already suffered enough loss. Gary's criminal desperation stemmed from gambling debts that had spiraled completely out of control, pushing him toward increasingly reckless crimes that Karen knew nothing about. His bookmakers had threatened violence if he didn't pay $25,000 by the end of the month, and Gary had convinced himself that Karen's courthouse scheme would somehow lead to bigger opportunities for financial gain. What he didn't understand was that appearing on national television while wearing stolen religious clothing would create evidence that prosecutors could use to demand the maximum sentence. The FBI had been building a case that could result in federal charges for transporting stolen goods across state lines, since Gary had sold some of the artifacts to dealers in New York and Pennsylvania. Karen's suburban empire of manipulation was built on a foundation of lies that were finally beginning to crumble under the weight of her own arrogance. Her homeowners association presidency had been achieved through a campaign of spreading rumors about her opponents, and her influence over local businesses came from threatening negative reviews and lawsuits against anyone who challenged her demands for special treatment. But federal law enforcement doesn't care about suburban politics, and Judge Judy's courtroom operates on a level of scrutiny that Karen has never faced before. If her fake priest scheme collapses today, it will trigger investigations into every aspect of her life, From her insurance claims to her tax returns to her pattern of targeting vulnerable neighbors. The truth was closing in from multiple directions, creating a perfect storm of justice that would either vindicate Mrs. Patterson and expose a criminal conspiracy, or allow Karen's web of lies to grow stronger and more dangerous. Judge Judy sat behind her bench, completely unaware that she was about to preside over a case that involved not just property disputes and fake witnesses, but federal crimes, stolen religious artifacts, and a pattern of elder abuse that had been escalating for months. The next few minutes would determine whether justice prevailed or whether Karen's criminal arrogance would be rewarded with the validation she needed to destroy even more lives. Judge Judy's gavel struck the bench with the authority of someone who had never lost a battle against deception. But as she looked down at Karen and her suspicious priest, she had no idea she was staring at the most elaborate criminal conspiracy ever to enter her courtroom. The case appeared straightforward in the preliminary notes. A neighbor, dispute over property damage with a character witness. But Judge Judy's legendary instincts immediately detected something rotten beneath Karen's overly sweet smile and theatrical religious display. Mrs. Middleton, Judge Judy began, her voice carrying that familiar edge that had made thousands of liars squirm over the decades. You're suing Mrs. Patterson for $3,500, claiming she damaged your fence during what you call aggressive gardening. Tell me exactly what happened. Karen stood up with exaggerated dignity, her fake diamond cross catching the courtroom lights as she launched into a performance worthy of a bad soap opera. Your Honor, Mrs. Patterson has been terrorizing me for months with her out-of-control vegetation, she declared, gesturing dramatically toward the frail elderly woman across the aisle. She deliberately planted invasive vines that destroyed my beautiful new fence, and when I asked her nicely to control her jungle, she became verbally abusive and threatened me with garden tools. The lies flowed from Karen's mouth like poison, each word carefully crafted to paint herself as the victim, while making Mrs. Patterson sound like a dangerous lunatic. Judge Judy's eyes narrowed as she studied Karen's body language, noting the telltale signs of deception, the slight tremor in her voice when she claimed to have asked nicely, the way her eyes darted away when describing the supposed threats, and the theatrical hand gestures that seemed designed to distract rather than illustrate. Behind Karen, the fake priest nodded along solemnly, his cheap rosary beads clicking together as his nervous hands fidgeted with the stolen religious props. And Father O'Brien here witnessed these interactions? Judge Judy asked, her sharp gaze shifting to Gary, who immediately began sweating profusely under the courtroom lights. The stolen vestments felt like they were burning his skin as he stammered. Yes, Your Honor, I was visiting Mrs. Middleton to discuss her wonderful charity work when I witnessed Mrs. Patterson's completely unprovoked aggression. His voice cracked on the word charity, and Judge Judy's famous intuition immediately flagged the inconsistency. In 25 years of courtroom experience, she had never heard a priest sound so uncertain when discussing charitable works. Mrs. Patterson sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, the picture of genuine dignity that stood in stark contrast to Karen's theatrical performance. When Judge Judy asked for her version of events, the elderly woman's voice trembled with authentic emotion as she described months of harassment, property destruction, and intimidation tactics designed to force her from the home she had lived in for 40 years. Your Honor, Mrs. Patterson said softly, I never threatened anyone. I simply asked Mrs. Middleton to move her fence back to the property line because it was blocking sunlight from my late husband's memorial garden. The mention of a memorial garden caused a visible shift in the courtroom atmosphere, and Judge Judy's expression softened slightly toward Mrs. Patterson, while hardening noticeably toward Karen. The fake priest's hands were now shaking so violently that he had to stuff them into his pockets to hide the tremors, while Karen's face flushed red with barely contained rage at Mrs. Patterson's sympathetic presentation. Judge Judy leaned forward, her predatory instincts fully engaged, sensing that she was about to uncover something far more significant than a simple neighbor dispute. Judge Judy's eyes locked onto the fake priest like a hawk spotting wounded prey, and her next words would shatter Karen's confidence forever. Father O'Brien, she said, her voice dropping to that dangerous tone that had destroyed countless liars. What parish do you serve? Gary's face went ghostly white as he stammered, St. Michael's, in Connecticut, his voice barely above a whisper. Judge Judy leaned forward, her legendary instincts screaming that something was catastrophically wrong with this supposed man of God. Interesting, Judge Judy replied, her tone sharp as a surgical blade. Because I called St. Michael's in Connecticut this morning, and they've never heard of a Father Michael O'Brien. In fact, they told me their vestments were stolen 3 weeks ago. The courtroom erupted in gasps as Gary's knees buckled, and Karen's face transformed from smug confidence to pure terror in seconds. The stolen priest costume suddenly felt like it was on fire as Gary realized he was wearing evidence of federal crimes on national television. Karen jumped to her feet, her voice rising to a shriek that echoed off the mahogany walls. "Your Honor, there must be some mistake. Father O'Brien is a very respected priest who's been counseling me through my difficult situation with this horrible neighbor." But Judge Judy's piercing stare silenced her mid-sentence, and the legendary judge's next words would expose the entire criminal conspiracy. "Mr. Peterson," Judge Judy said, using Gary's real name with devastating precision. "Because that's who you really are, isn't it? Gary Peterson, Karen's brother-in-law with a gambling problem and a criminal record." The fake priest's rosary beads clattered to the floor as his trembling hands could no longer hold them, and Karen's world began collapsing around her. Mrs. Patterson watched in stunned amazement as the woman, who had terrorized her for months, was systematically destroyed by the one person in America who could see through any deception. Judge Judy wasn't finished, she was just getting started. And the real fireworks were about to begin. Gary's complete mental breakdown began with a single whimper that grew into full-blown hysteria as he ripped off the stolen priest collar and threw it on the courtroom floor. "I can't do this anymore," he screamed, his voice cracking like a teenager's as 25 years of Judge Judy's legendary authority crushed his soul. "Karen made me do it. She said it was just a costume. But I stole it from the church because I owe money to dangerous people." The courtroom exploded in chaos as Gary's confession poured out like a broken dam, revealing not just the fake priest scheme, but a web of federal crimes that sent Karen into complete panic mode. Judge Judy sat back in her chair with the satisfied expression of a master predator who had just delivered the killing blow, watching as Karen's entire world disintegrated before her eyes. "You stole religious vestments from a church," Judge Judy said, her voice cutting through Gary's sobs like a blade. "Brought them into my courtroom, and thought you could fool me with this pathetic charade?" Gary nodded frantically, tears streaming down his face as he babbled about gambling debts, stolen chalices, and the FBI investigation that Karen knew nothing about. The camera captured every moment of his complete psychological collapse as he begged Judge Judy for mercy that would never come. Karen's meltdown was even more spectacular than Gary's, as she realized her entire suburban empire was crumbling on national television. "You can't do this to me," she shrieked, her face purple with rage as she pointed accusingly at Judge Judy. "I'm Karen Middleton. I run the Homeowners Association. I have connections." But Judge Judy's legendary death stare silenced her tantrum immediately, and her next words would deliver the final devastating blow. "Mrs. Middleton, you brought a criminal wearing stolen religious clothing into my courtroom to commit perjury against an elderly woman. You're not just losing this case, you're facing federal charges." The bailiff stepped forward as Karen continued screaming about lawsuits and connections. But Judge Judy wasn't finished destroying her yet. "And Mrs. Patterson," the legendary judge said, turning to the elderly woman who sat in stunned silence, "not only are you getting your court costs, but I'm personally ensuring that the FBI investigates every aspect of Mrs. Middleton's harassment campaign against you." Mrs. Patterson began crying tears of relief as Karen was finally held accountable for months of terror, while Gary continued his complete breakdown in the stolen investments that would send him to federal prison. Within hours of the episode airing, Karen's courtroom meltdown exploded across social media platforms like wildfire, with fake Karen Priest trending worldwide as millions watched her spectacular downfall on repeat. TikTok users created remix videos of her screaming, "I'm Karen Middleton," while Twitter users shared memes of Gary ripping off the stolen priest collar in pure terror. The FBI moved swiftly to arrest both conspirators before they could flee, with Gary's gambling creditors ironically providing additional evidence about his desperate crimes when they tried to collect their debts from a man now facing federal prison. Mrs. Patterson became an overnight internet hero, with a GoFundMe campaign raising over $50,000 to restore her late husband's memorial garden that Karen had destroyed. Local news stations camped outside Karen's McMansion, as her homeowners association voted unanimously to remove her from all positions and investigate her years of abuse against elderly residents. The stolen religious artifacts were recovered from various pawnshops across 3 states, with Father O'Sullivan personally thanking Judge Judy for exposing the sacrilege that had devastated his parish community. Karen's mugshot, taken while she was still wearing her leopard print blouse and fake diamond cross, became the most shared arrest photo of the year. Gary's complete psychological breakdown in stolen investments created the most watched courtroom clip in television history, surpassing even Judge Judy's most legendary takedowns of previous defendants. 6 months later, Karen Middleton sat in federal prison wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of leopard print, her entitled suburban kingdom reduced to a 8x10 cell, where her only authority was over which book to read from the prison library. The woman who once terrorized elderly neighbors and manipulated local officials now scrubbed floors and folded laundry under the watchful eyes of corrections officers who couldn't care less about her former Homeowners Association presidency. Gary received an even harsher sentence after pleading guilty to federal theft charges. His gambling addiction finally conquered by the reality of 24 months behind bars, where the only bet he could make was on prison commissary cookies. Mrs. Patterson's memorial garden bloomed more beautifully than ever, funded by donations from strangers who had watched her vindication unfold on national television. The elderly woman became a symbol of resilience against bullying, receiving letters of support from abuse survivors worldwide who saw their own struggles reflected in her quiet dignity. Judge Judy's masterful exposure of the fake priest conspiracy became required viewing in law schools as the perfect example of how preparation, instinct, and unwavering authority could destroy even the most elaborate deceptions. The stolen religious vestments were blessed and returned to St. Mary's Cathedral, where Father O'Sullivan used Karen's story as a powerful sermon about the consequences of exploiting faith for personal gain. Judge Judy's legendary status reached new heights as the woman who could see through criminal conspiracies disguised as neighborly disputes, proving once again that truth always emerges when faced with genuine authority and wisdom. Karen learned the hardest lesson of her entitled life: that real power comes from respect and honesty, not manipulation and intimidation.